Now let's discuss river exploits where you can make or potentially lose a lot of money depending on how well you exploit your opponent. The most important river exploits all come from GTO river theory principles. If you recall, the scenario where you are on the river facing an out-of-position player who makes a pot size all-in, you need to win 33% of the time to break even, right? You have to put in one pot size bet to try to win the pot, their pot size bet, and your call. So you need to win 1/3 of the time. Your opponent will bluff 33% of the time, assuming they're a good, strong, world-class player, with the other portion of their range being 67% value hands. And this will force your bluff catchers to be indifferent between calling or folding. So in this situation, you should call 50% of your range to reach the minimum defense frequency because they're betting one pot into one pot. So you have to call half of the time. But what happens in this scenario, as we've outlined it, if you will fold 100% of the time with your bluff catchers, which will be your entire range? Well, in this scenario, your opponent wins the pot, right? Because you're folding and they win whatever's in the pot. And if you call with 50% of your bluff catchers to reach the minimum defense frequency, assuming your opponent's playing a perfectly polarized range, what happens? Well, 2/3 of the time times 3 pots minus 0.33 times 3 pots equals 1 pot. So essentially what's happening here is the congruent strategy being developed where your opponent's expected value is the same, it's congruent, across all sorts of deviations. And this is why it's important to structure a good betting range to begin with. So essentially, as long as they're using the strategy they are using with 2/3 value bets, 1/3 bluffs, and you're calling with all bluff catchers, it doesn't matter actually how often you call, they are going to win the pot in this situation because they've structured their range accordingly. And this concept should be very freeing because it will allow you to go for exploits. It means that if you think your opponent is playing well, you can deviate to either call every time or fold every time with your bluff catchers, and they will gain no EV unless they adjust their strategy in the future to take advantage of what they think you are doing wrong, which would be to, call every time or fold every time. So this leads us to the second river theory principle that's important for exploits, and that's understanding the EV of bluff catchers. Let's go back to the original example. You're facing a 100% pot size all-in, and you have a range full of bluff catchers. Your opponent has 2/3 premium hands, 1/3 bluffs, and you need to call 50% of the time. Since you know it does not affect your EV to call every time or fold every time, you've been folding every time. Okay? You folded every time against this player. You're concerned that your opponent in this moment is perhaps going to be a bit too inclined to bluff because they think you fold too often. So you estimate their range is now 62% value and 38% bluffs. You think they're bluffing just a little bit too often, right? They should have 33%, but they have 38%. So what should you do? Well, you should call more often, of course, because they're bluffing more often. The question becomes, how much more should you call more often? Well, it turns out you should actually call every single time with all of your bluff catchers in this scenario. If someone overbluffs even by a little bit, because if you recall, the bluff catchers are 0 EV against a perfect GTO range because you win the pot exactly as often as you need to. And this causes your hand to be indifferent between calling or folding. But if you win any amount more than 33% of the time, which were your pot odds, you should actually call every time now because it's profitable in this situation because you're going to win more than 33% of the time, right? You thought they were going to be bluffing 38%. It means you're going to be winning 38%, but you only need to win 33%, presuming their range is structured with 68 or 62% value hands and 38% bluffs, and all of your range are bluff catchers. So you need to figure out how to use this in game. We're going to go through some examples. But you have to get comfortable with this. You'll find sometimes the best players make pretty big hero calls on the river, and it's often because they think their opponent's simply bluffing a little bit too often. If you think someone is over bluffing, you call with every bluff catcher. And to be very clear, bluff catcher is a hand that beats your opponent's bluffs. If you lose to some of your opponent's bluffs, it's not a bluff catcher. It's not a good hand. If you think someone is under bluffing, though, as a lot of players will, especially in the small and middle stakes for big bets, right? You should actually fold every bluff catcher. Alternatively, if you're on the other side of the equation, if you think your opponent will call more than the minimum defense frequency, if you think they're going to call too often, you should never bluff. And if you think they will fold more than the minimum defense frequency, you should bluff with everything. And you can do this knowing that if you're wrong, assuming your opponent's playing good, perfect poker, your adjustment does not even lose any EV. And this is why it's so important to understand GTO strategies. It helps you understand what your baseline strategy should be. And as you master this and try to really give your opponent a accurate range, you can categorize them into over bluffing or under bluffing, and then you can adjust quite far from GTO. You do need to be aware, though, that the only way you're going to get counter exploited is if they do adjust. If they do, let's, for example, say, think that you're bluffing too often. Well, if you think they're bluffing too often, and so you have been calling them, and then they adjust to never bluff in a spot because they know you like to call, you can really, really get punished for going for the river exploit. So you need to make sure that you are playing against players who either will not adjust, or at least you're kind of aware of the adjustments they may be potentially making. And of course, if you don't know what your opponents are doing in a particular spot and they seem to play well, it's probably best just to play good, strong GTO poker. But again, you'll find some players bluff way too often or way too infrequently, and if you can adjust to take advantage of that, you will absolutely crush them. Let's take a look at some examples to make this way more clear. Let's go through some river exploits where I will generally recommend you adjust away from GTO strategy, because quite often the player pool in general will not get to the river with the same river that a good, strong GTO player will get to the river with. So let's take a look at this hand. We raise the king, queen suited, and the big blind calls. Flop comes jack 8-6. They check. We can continuation bet big a decent amount of the time. They call. Turns the jack of spades, and they check again. Now, at this point, bluffing the king jack is certainly not mandatory, but I think it is fine and good, especially if you think you can get them to fold out various 6x, under pairs, and ace high. So they check. We bet using a chunky size to target that range, and they call. River's a two of spades, and we have to figure out what to do after they check. This is a situation where I don't think most people actually end up at the river with the same range that a perfect GTO player would. In GTO world, this is going to be an easy all-in, again, to target the range of ace-high, eights, and sixes. But let's take a look at this in peak and see how I think this is going to play out in reality. We raise the hijack, big blind calls. It comes jack 8-6. They check. We bet 2/3 pot. Right off the bat, notice they should raise ace-jack, king-jack, queen-jack some chunk of the time. I don't think a lot of people do. I think a lot of people simply check and call the flop far too often. So if they check and call the flop far too often with these hands, notice these hands are going to be quite good by the river. And of course, the opponent would check call flop, probably check call turn, and obviously check call river. So that's bad for us immediately. Say we do bet, though, and they call, and the turn is the jack of spades, and they check again. Notice king queen is bluffing some, king 10, king 9 are bluffing even more, but king queen is bluffing about half of the time using the chunky size to try to get them to fold out various hands like pocket pairs and some sixes. And notice some sixes should fold immediately. Also ace highs should fold immediately if they have them. And I think this is pretty reasonable. However, take a look at the raising range. They should again raise with various hands containing three of a kind. So because they should raise with various hands containing three of a kind, when they do just check call them instead, which I do think a lot of people do, I don't think anybody is really raising the jack 3 on the jack 8-6 jack all that often. If they're not raising and they call instead on the river's a two of spades, and they check, recognize their checking range has all of these low jack X suiteds in them. They could also have more ace jack, king jack, queen jack in them. Also, I think a lot of people may overfold with something like a 6 on the turn every time, which would be a little bit too tight. You see some of them call, but that's something you need to be aware of. So on the river, this is going to be a bluff with our hand, but notice if we do bluff, take a look at what their strategy should be. Well, notice now, eights are mixing, but realize they're going to have a lot of jack X in their range, far more than the GTO strategy, right? Also, if you've been playing an aggressive strategy in general, I don't think anyone's going to fold an 8 on jack 8, 6, jack 2 when all the draws miss on the river. If you've been playing loose, aggressive, battle-y poker, like if I'm playing against a good, strong, world-class player who I know likes to bluff the river, I'm not going to fold an 8 here, even though clearly 8 should be mixing folds. So if I think my opponent has more jack X in their range And on top of that, I think they're simply not going to fold an 8. Well, then this becomes a very, very bad spot to bluff, right? And I know, I see here that they have some 6s that need a hero call that I think will overfold. I don't think a lot of people know to call with like 8-6 blocking full houses, but I think this is a spot where it's very, very easy for the opponent to find hero calls with an 8 and also to have far too many Jack X in their range that is not represented here. So this is a spot where you do not need to bluff against most people. Betting the turn is fine because I do think you will get various 6X to fold and ace high and under pairs to fold. But I think in the real world, it's okay to just give up here. You're going to be shown far too many Jack X. Let's take a look at another spot. 6-5 of spades. Button raises. We call the big blind. Ace 7-5. We check. They bet. We call. Turn is a 2 of spades. We check. They check. Okay. River 8. Should we lead? We do not this time. And now they bet half pot on the river. So let's take a look at this spot in peak. This is a situation where in GTO world, we are probably going to fold every time. However, let's take a look at the hands in the opponent's range that they could logically have. So notice here we call the 6-5 suited. It comes ace 7-5, ace 7-5. We check. They used the small size. Let's just rewind the hand, make sure we get it right. And we called. Okay. They use a small size. 6-5 is mostly calling. Notice there is a little bit of raise with bottom pair, backdoor draws, but we call this time. 2 of spades. We're going to check, and they check it back. River is the 8 of clubs. Can we make a tiny bet? Nope, not quite good enough. Notice the 8 goes for the tiny bet, but not the 6. So, in the spot we check, and they go half pot. Take a look at this range the opponent could reasonably have to get here in the scenario, and take a look at what should not be bluffing. Notice here, if the opponent has Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, Jack 9, 10 9, they should not be bluffing in this situation. So you have to ask yourself, if my opponent was sitting here on the river with 10 9, Jack 9, Jack 10, Queen 10, Queen Jack, maybe even King High, the weaker ones, like King 6, are these hands that they would bluff close to every time? And I think a lot of players will bluff close to every time. So in situations like this, I'm always trying to ask myself if my opponent will have various offsuit hands in their range they will check back the turn and then get to the river with that don't feel all that good. And in this scenario, I think very clearly that this big chunk of hands I've outlined will feel pretty inclined to bluff. So one of my favorite exploits against generally aggressive players, or people in general, is to call down pretty wide in spots where the opponent's going to have a lot of offsuit hands in their turn check range that they recognize cannot win at the showdown very often. And then we're going to find hero calls. Against the half pot bet in this scenario, 6-5 is folding, raising, or calling, but mixing lots of folds, right? So, cool scenario where I think a pretty reasonable exploit is to simply call too often in the spot because, like I said, it's very, very easy for the opponent to be over bluffing with all of those hands like Queen High and worse that logically cannot win at the showdown. So that's the spot where I definitely like overcalling. This time we just win. Pocket sevens. We raise it up. Big blind calls. Flop comes Queen 6-6. They check. We bet small. They raise. Right off the bat, you may say, should we find a fold immediately? And I would say that would be way too tight. Notice we raise cutoff. Big blind calls. Comes Queen 6-6. They check. We continuation bet small. Notice this is a spot we should be a little bit careful. You don't get to bet it every time. They now raise us. Take a look at the raises. Notice in this situation, the opponent should be raising all sorts of backdoor draws. Now, again, you have to ask, is my opponent decent at poker? Are they well studied? Will they put in the check raise with King Jack, King 10, Jack 10, 10 9, 9 8, 8 7, 5 4, 4 3? A lot of people in this spot will check raise every time with a 6, sometimes with a queen, and way too infrequently with hands in this region. But let's say they do raise and we do call. This is what I'll call very, very frequently, like every time, because if you do happen to spike a 7, you just love your hand very, very clearly. So we do call, turns to 3, they bet again, pot. There's actually a flush draw on the flop. Let's go through and put that in just to make it a little bit more accurate. Queen, 6, 6. Okay, check, small bet, raise, and then call. Turn is the 3 of, not a flush, 3 of clubs, and they pot it. As you see, they will do a decent chunk of the time. Take a look at this range that will pot the turn. Lots of 6s, not really a lot of queens, and then all sorts of draws. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of flush draws. Do you think your opponent's going to continue potting it with all flush draws on the turn? Maybe, maybe not. Take a look over here. Do you think they're potting it with King 9, King 7, Ace 7, Ace 5? Do we think they're potting it with those hands? I would say basically never. So in this situation, this is a spot where I don't think most people bluff nearly often enough with the offsuit hands. They may still bluff with stuff like 7-5, 7-4, etc. They may still bluff with flush draws, but it's very, very hard to find these very low equity bluffs. Also, notice we have some hands like Ace 7 of clubs, Ace 7 of hearts, Ace 8 of spades, right? King Jack, lots of them. And I think a lot of people in the spot simply don't continue bluffing. And while I do think they will miss some check raises on the flop, making their range stronger to begin with, I think at this point they're going to be even stronger than GTO. So I know this is not exactly a river spot, but I think this is a really good spot to fold immediately. We just let it go. Ace 10 of hearts. Low jack raises. We call the big blind. Ace, king, jack. We check. They bet. We're going to call. Let's just go ahead and get this lined up in peak. We can go through it as we go. Low jack raises. Folds around to us. We call the big blind with ace 10 suited. It comes ace, king, jack. Ace, king, jack. We check. They go big, right? Do you think we're going to raise here? Nope, not that often. You do always want to raise your best top pair for the most part. That's usually like ace, queen, right, in these scenarios. So we call. Turn is the 2 of spades. We check, and now they bet big again. So what I want to do is I want to look at this first. Do you think your opponent's going to bet every time on this flop? I do. So far, so good. Nothing is out of line here. We call, turns to 2 of spades. We're going to check, and now they pot it. Notice they should use the pot a decent amount of the time. Let's take a look at what the pot range is in this situation. This is a spot where I think if your opponent is on the aggressive side, they will keep bluffing with under pairs in this spot. Now, some people will never underbluff, or never bluff with under pairs. They don't know that's a thing. But if your opponent is a loose, aggressive, studied poker player, in this spot they do know they should bluff these some. And I think a lot of people in this spot will really, really overdo it because they look at the rest of their range and they're like, okay, a lot of the rest of this range doesn't really want to bluff. Like you don't really want to bluff the 9-8 here, the 10-9, 10-8, etc. So I think this is a spot where a lot of people can be easily betting too often with low pairs. So they bet big. We, of course, call ace 10. River is the 3 of clubs. We check and they go all in. 3 of clubs. We check. They rip it in. Notice what they should be bluffing with. Again, it is not the low pairs. I think a lot of people bluff too often on the turn with low pairs. And I think if they get to the river with the low pairs, they will still be inclined to bluff them. Because again, if they look at the rest of their range, it's kind of hard to find bluffs. Now, I do see they are bluffing here with stuff like Jack 10, Jack 9, Jack 8 blocking our calling range, which, you know, are some hands they may have in their range, but I'm not even sure a lot of people bet these on the turn to begin with, right? So these may not be in their range, but these I think will be in their range at far fuller frequencies, and I think a lot of people will automatically bluff them. If they did happen to bet the turn with these, I think they also will bluff them. In terms of value bets, yeah, they may value bet ace queen, maybe, but that's about it, right? In this scenario, I think all the other value bets are pretty logical, so they may overvalue bet a little bit too much with ace queen, but I think here, against someone who is decently studied, who recognizes they should bluff the turn sometimes with the small pairs, and then they may think they need to continue bluffing him. This is a spot that I think it's very, very, very easy for the opponent to be over bluffing. Therefore, we should find the hero calls. If they do jam, by the way, Notice ace-10 mixes, right? And this is essentially what you want to be looking at. You want to be looking at spots that are mixes that you could potentially have turn into folds. And if you look at this range to begin with, it's a pretty decent range, right? I do think ace-10 is an okay one to call with in general, even though it's one of the least called ace-X. But in the real world, I think I'm calling here the vast majority of the time against most people, even though I do realize you can be in bad shape. Now, if your opponent does not know to bluff with small pairs ever, right? Say they they are on the turn and they don't bet any small pairs, and perhaps they don't bet any queen X, and they don't bet any jack X, right? So they have no queen X, they have no jack X. That means they literally have an ace or better, right? So if, in that scenario, if it runs off like this, and I check and they jam, again, notice this random jack X is shoving. These random low cards are shoving, right? And if they don't have those in their range, well, that will very quickly tilt this to become a fold, even with the top pair. So always try to consider what your particular opponent does wrong compared to GTO. Here I have a spot where someone raises under the gun +1. We call 10-8 suited in the cutoff. We make two pair. They check. We bet. They check raise. Okay? Let's already ask ourselves right off the bat, do we think they're check raising anywhere near GTO? So they raise under the gun +1. We call the cutoff. 10-8 suited. Comes 10-8-6. They check. We bet small. They now raise us. What do we think they're raising with in the real world? Aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace-10, right? I mean, all that makes a lot of sense. Notice we're way ahead of that at the moment. Do we think they're raising queen-9, jack-9, king-jack, king-queen with a diamond, ace-queen with a diamond, ace-jack with a diamond? Do we think they're raising those? I think a lot of people have a pretty easy time hitting the check-raise frequencies with the best hands, ace-10 and better, but not so much with these junky hands. So let's just keep that in mind as we move forward. We, of course, well, I say of course, when they raise, I don't think we're going to do much jamming here. This is a spot where they're going to be very polarized in general, as we just saw, so 10-8 does just call. Turn is the 4 spades. They check again. We are now going to go for the bet. We go for a small bet here. Let's see if Peak likes that small bet. After they check, I know we're going to bet frequently. The question is, are we going to be betting small or medium? And it looks like the small size is preferred with the 10-8. And that is the size that's mostly used. We're betting, you know, linear-ish. And they call. Rivers and ace of diamonds. What do you think we should do after they check? Well, 10-8 is going to be good enough to bet. Now, this is always an interesting spot because if you look at our range, it is very polarized to bet in general, all in, right? And if you look at our categories here, the all-in range is flushes, sets, some two pairs, and then bluffs, right? So the question then becomes, is this a spot where we should have this tiny bet range with exactly this 10-8? Because if you look at this range, it is 10-8 and queen-jack for nothing. And that's about it, right? You will find that sometimes GTO solvers do split the ranges, especially when 10-8 is just good enough to value bet. Because notice when we value bet, they are supposed to call stuff like king-10, king-8, queen-10, jack-10, right? So this is a situation where we definitely can get called by worse for the small bet. I know it feels a little uncomfortable, but it is a good play in the spot to have this strategy. Now, when we do bet small, take a look at what is raising. Because, spoiler alert, we're going to bet small and they're going to jam us. Do we call it off with the 10-8? Well, take a look at what should jam. I know it's kind of hard to see the frequencies. Let's actually do this to make them full size. They should be jamming pocket kings with a diamond over our pretty chunky bet on the river. They should also jam ace king with a diamond. These are bluffs, by the way. These are bluffs blocking our calls, slap, it comes with flushes and whatnot. Do we think people in the real world ever check shove kings or ace king with a diamond in the spot? And I think the answer is just absolutely not. Do we think they're check raising jack 10 every once in a while? Or queen 10 every once in a while, which is just second pair? Again, I would say absolutely not. So in this situation, I think it is very, very, very hard for the opponent to find bluffs. And this will often be the case in the real world, where when you bet kind of chunky on the river and people check raise you, they simply don't have nearly enough bluffs. So this is a spot where I think you can be pretty happy to bet and then fold to the shove. So always make a point to try to consider what your opponent does wrong, but also how their range is far from GTO as the play progresses. And especially in smaller stakes games or games where you have very good reads on your opponent or the player pool in general, you need to make sure you're aware of how their strategy should differ from GTO. I mean, I think a really good example of that was this Jack X hand, right? Or the Jack paired board, where a lot of people don't check raise often enough with the Jack on the flop, don't check raise often enough with the Jack on the turn, and therefore their range has far too many Jacks on the river. And this is a spot where if you just look at a GTO output, you would just bluff it off every time with, well, lots of king highs, as we saw, and you'd be drastically over bluffing in these scenarios. And I want to make sure that you are logically exploiting the mistakes your opponents are making, and always taking your time and going through both players' ranges will help you go a long way to figuring out if you should be over bluffing or under bluffing a spot, or over calling against a bet or under calling against a bet on the river.